Thank you very much for this kind invitation to come here, and thank you, Helen, for the warm welcome, and thank you to all in the Historical Society here and here in this beautiful History Centre. I have not been here before. I hope it's not my last time. Apart from anything else, I hope someday to write a history of Irish whiskey, and I know this town is steeped in the history, and I see the old barrel store next door, so it's fantastic to be here. And I'd like to also thank Kieran McCabe for inviting me here. Kieran unfortunately can't be with us this evening, and I'd like to thank all those people online and all those people who may catch up with this at a later date on YouTube. So I'll begin at the beginning, as they say. On the 22nd of June 1922, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson was shot dead on the doorstep of his own home at 36 Eaton Place by two disabled Great War veterans of the First World War, turned Irish nationalists Reggie Dunn and Joseph O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan had lost a leg at Passchendaele. Dunn's right knee was shattered during the German Spring Offensive of March 1918. And the two were quickly apprehended, as you will see from the next slide. This is an image that from the time that was in the American newspapers, and it's quite an accurate representation of what happened. There was a hue and cry, an old-fashioned hue and cry, and they caught up with the two men, and they were apprehended. But only after shooting and injuring two policemen. They were put on trial for murder, sentenced to death, and hanged on the 10th of August 1922. Those are the bald facts of the Wilson shooting, but it's the impact on the course of Irish history which makes this a most interesting and catastrophic event. So, as I say in the title of my book, the title of my lecture, I should say, the Wilson shooting was Ireland's Sarajevo moment. And as students of history, you will recall how the shooting of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo on June the 28th, 1914, led to the ultimatum from Serbia from Austria, and Germany gave Austria the famous blank check. The Russian Empire intervened on the side of Serbia, and you had the two interlocking alliances, the Triple Entente and the Central Powers, at war with each other within 37 days. So everything comes from this one event, and there's been thousands of books about the origins of the First World War. One I really recommend is The Sleepwalkers, but they all come back to that single point, if you think of it like a triangle, or the Big Bang moment of the 20th century. And obviously the First World War was not the cause, it was not caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The causes were much, much greater and much more in depth than that, but it was the catalyst. And I make the point, I guess, in my book, that it's like having a powder keg in a room. That powder keg is inert until somebody lights the fuse. So every situation in history has a chance to be a powder keg, but somebody's got to light the fuse. So to go back to the origins of the First World War, the historian Fritz Stern described World War I as the first calamity of the 20th century, the calamity from which all other calamities sprang. So without Sarajevo, there's no First World War, and the entire history of the world would be different. Without the First World War, there's no Bolshevik Revolution, there's no Second World War, there's no Cold War. There's no Irish Revolution either, because the Irish Revolution is an event which happened as a consequence of the First World War. So you can tell that assassinations are in history very much pivotal events that they're almost like a hinge moment in history where they change the course of everything. What kind of a country would America be had Abraham Lincoln not been killed? What about John F. Kennedy? And so on. And I think that my point here that I'm coming to is that the Wilson shooting bears the same relationship to Ireland as the Sarajevo shooting does to the world. So without the Wilson shooting, there's no British ultimatum to the Provisional Government, there's no shelling of the forecourts and therefore no civil war. Michael Collins would have lived. The history of the new state would have been different if there was no civil war. Maybe there would have been no Fianna Fáil and no Fine Gael. This is all obviously conjecture, but it's important when you consider the significance of this event to think about the counterfactual history. What would happen if Henry Wilson hadn't been shot on his doorstep in, I don't know what happened there. So the impact of the Wilson shooting has been underestimated because of the assumption that the Civil War would have happened anyway, and his death only hastened the inevitable. Yet, as IRA Commander Florrie O'Donoghue remembered, despite 6 months of the talk of the possibility of civil war, no one had allowed himself to believe it to be inevitable, and no plan existed on either side for conducting it. And one of the many ironies of this shooting is that this catalyst for civil war had nothing to do with the treaty split, which we know is the reason for the civil war, and everything to do with the other civil war going on north of the border. And Wilson was held responsible by nationalist Ireland for the excesses of British state forces in the north and the imposition of the so-called Flogging Act, the Special Powers Act in March 1922. And there's been a lot of unnecessary speculation over the years as to why Wilson was shot. The answer is in the statement given by Dunn and O'Sullivan and published in the Irish Independent on the 12th of August 1922, 2 days after they were hanged. Who was Henry Wilson? What was his policy and what did he stand for? You've all read in the newspapers lately and been told that he was the great British Field Marshal, but his activities in other fields are unknown to the bulk of the British public. The nation to which we have the honour to belong, the Irish nation, knows him not so much as the great British Field Marshal, but as the man behind what is known in Ireland as the Orange Terror. He was at the time of his death the military advisor to what is colloquially called the Ulster Government, and as a military advisor he raised and organised a body of men known as the Ulster Special Constabulary, who are the principal agents in his campaign of terrorism. But the shooting of Wilson laid bare the frustrations of the British government with its provisional Irish counterpart. The former viewed with exasperation the tolerance afforded to the anti-treaty rebels who had occupied the forecourts unmolested since April 13th, 1922. The British government had also bridled at the electoral pact between Collins and De Valera in May 1922, which was a bid to stave off civil war and not make the election of June the 16th, 1922, which is the first election in the new Irish state, a referendum on the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And the Taoiseach, when he was Taoiseach, Micheál Martin said of the Civil War, it's impossible to miss the destructive role played by the London government, first in its rigid inflexibility in relation to the treaty, and secondly, its constant and ultimately successful push for actions against anti-treaty forces. And this is an interesting perspective on the causes of the Civil War. I assume it is the Wilson shooting is what the Taoiseach, or the former Taoiseach, I should say, is alluding to when he refers to the quote-unquote constant and ultimately successful push for action against anti-treaty forces. And when he speaks of rigid inflexibility, I'm assuming again he's referring to the repudiation of the draft Irish constitution drawn up by a committee headed by Michael Collins and a plan for the pact of election of June 1922 that would see anti-treaty politicians sit in an Irish government. And if you go back to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was predicated on three things. The first one was that a new general election was held in the Irish state, that government, whatever government hue it would be, would ratify the treaty, and then it would pass a constitution. And those are very, very important things to remember about the Free State. The Irish Free State didn't actually come into being till December of 1922, and it was the government, the Irish Free State government, did not take power till December 1922. Up until that point, it was provisional. And I think that word is often overlooked, is provisional on these three things happening. And this is a very, very critical time in history, in Irish history. So the British and the Irish are engaged in the run-up to the June 1922 election in putting together a constitution. And the draft constitution that the Irish side said contained no reference to an oath of allegiance to the king, even though that was agreed as part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And it also is a direct repudiation of Article 17 of the treaty, which states that every Irish government minister shall have signified in writing his or her acceptance of the treaty. And it was planned that after the election, the Sinn Féin members, pro and anti-treaty, would take their seats with 6 in an inner cabinet who have taken the oath. So they would be members of the cabinet having taken the oath, and 4 in the outer cabinet. How that would work, I don't know. But the British government did not like this prospect at all. For them, it was absolutely critical that the oath of allegiance was taken by the members of the Irish government. Why? Because of the precedent it would set. There were a lot of other places in the empire that were looking for greater freedom. India being one, Iraq, known as Mesopotamia at the time, Egypt, even Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And interestingly enough, as you would have seen from the coronation at the weekend, those 3 countries, Australia, New Zealand and India, still have an oath of, or sorry, not India, but Canada, still have an oath of allegiance to the British monarch, which is bizarre in this day and age, but it's true. And so the attempt to stave off civil war came butt up against the British objection to any politician being in government that would not sign up to the treaty. And the Constitution of the Free State was published in the newspapers 100 years ago on June the 16th, 1922, which was the day of the general election. That was a coincidence. It wasn't intended to leave it that late in the process, but obviously in the to and fro, the Constitution didn't get finalised till that period of time, and the new Constitution contained the oath of allegiance. But, and this is a significant but, who was the oath of allegiance to? Most people assume it was to King George V, as it was at the time. But in fact, the oath of allegiance say, I do solemnly swear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State as by law established, and that I will be faithful to King George V. Now, you might think that this is a semantic difference, but as far as Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith were concerned, this really obviated the idea that this was an oath of allegiance to the king, and a huge amount of work and effort went into the framing of the wording of this oath. And then it states that all powers of government and all authority, legislative, executive and judicial in Ireland are derived not from the British Crown, but from the people of Ireland. In the June bank holiday, or in the June general election in Ireland, pro or treaty neutral candidates got 78% of the vote. The anti-treaty side just 22%. This was a crushing defeat for those who rejected the treaty. More importantly, from a British point of view, it was a mandate for the Provisional Government to govern. And as I said, the word provisional here is important. It means, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, arranged or existing for the present, possibly to be changed later. And so think about the timing of this. The general election is held on the 16th of June, 1922. And the last results are literally coming in. Obviously, it's 6 days. And you have to bring in ballot papers from islands and from very bad roads, etc. So it's the very last day of counting is the 22nd of June. And suddenly it goes from being all about politics to being all about Wilson. And on the evening of the 22nd of June, Lloyd George now seized his chance. He told Michael Collins that documents had been found on one of the assassins, done as it turned out, linking him with the anti-treaty IRA. The documents turned out to be a copy of a Thuglook, the IRA newspaper that could be bought at newsstands in Ireland. Whether Lloyd George truly believed it or not, he now had the pretext to act, he wrote to Collins. The ambiguous position of the Irish Republican Army can no longer be or ignored by the British government. Still less can Rory O'Connor, who's the leader of the anti-treaty rebels, be permitted to remain with his followers in open rebellion in the heart of Dublin in possession of the courts of justice, organising and sending out from this centre enterprises of murder not only in the area of your government but also in the 6 northern counties and in Great Britain. And bear in mind, at this stage the British still retained a garrison of 6,000 soldiers in Ireland. And an hour after receiving the news, Neville McCreevy, the officer commanding in Ireland, was summoned to London. There he found the British cabinet in a state of suppressed agitation and spoiling for revenge. Churchill was charged with a feverish impetuosity. In haste, he proposed to send Royal Navy ships to Dublin with reinforcements and weaponry for the British garrison, and the treaty would be declared invalid. Wiser counsel prevailed and the proposed British attack was postponed. And I can tell you that I have had advance sight of a documentary that's going out on Wednesday by Michael Portillo about the Irish Civil War. And there's a very interesting passage in it where he talks about that Churchill had offered the Provisional Government four British fighter planes from the First World War, which had been modified to be bombers. They could carry 20-pound bombs, and the Provisional Government refused the offer. Macready would write many years later in his memoirs that he thanked Providence he had stopped the British government acting on his threat, as it would have meant a resumption of the war between Britain and Ireland, which would have ended in the same unsatisfactory stalemate as the previous one. Nevertheless, in the House of Commons 4 days after the shooting, we're talking about the 26th of June, Churchill said in public what he told the Irish in private: they would act against the anti-treaty rebels if the Provisional Government did not. The time has come when it is not unfair, not premature, and not impatient for us to make this strengthened Irish government, a new Irish Parliament, a request in express terms that this sort of thing must come to an end. And note the word here, strengthened. The mandate has been given to the Free State government through the Irish electorate, but Churchill is saying, now get on with it. Fortunately for the Provisional Government, the anti-treaty side played into their hands. In revenge for the arrest of Leo Henderson, an anti-treaty officer who had organised a raid on Ferguson's garage in Baggot Street, the anti-treaty side captured Lieutenant General J.J. Ginger O'Connell on June the 26th. Ostensibly, this was the reason for the shelling of the four courts, prompting an ultimatum from the Provisional Government. Outrages such as these against the nation and the government must cease at once and cease forever. For some months past, all classes of business in Ireland have suffered severely through the feeling of insecurity engendered by reckless and wicked acts which have tarnished the reputation of Ireland abroad. So an ultimatum was issued to the anti-treaty rebels, and the shelling began at 3:50 a.m. on the 28th of June. Now, as you can see from what I've just said, you go in the space of June, from in 12 days, June the 16th, you have the first general election in the Irish Free State. It's a triumph of democracy. It's a triumph and it is a well-run general election, and there's a fair outcome and so on. 6 days later, you have the assassination of Field Marshal Henry Wilson, and 6 days after that, you have the Civil War. So the country just goes like that, from jaw to war in the space of less than 2 weeks. So therefore, there are three principal reasons I believe the Civil War broke out when it did, and how it did and when it did. The principal reason was the Wilson shooting that I alluded to, and the British ultimatum which concentrated the mind of the Provisional Government. The second was, I mentioned before, the kidnapping of Lieutenant General O'Connor, which was the immediate casus belli. The third reason, I believe, was the mandate given to pro- or treaty-neutral forces in the general election from June the 16th. So before that, there had been agitation within the Provisional Government, especially from Arthur Griffith and from Kevin O'Higgins, to move against the rebels in the forecourt. But the Provisional Government hadn't felt it was too weak to do this. It had no mandate from the public to do that, and it hadn't tested the mandate that it had. And now it had. And so the provisional government had no mandate for the election. After the election, they could argue they could have one. Certainly the defeat of anti-treaty candidates strengthened the hand of those in the cabinet who wanted a reckoning with the anti-treaty rebels. So in order to understand the importance of the Wilson shooting in Irish history, let's do a little counterfactual analysis. I know historians don't like counterfactual because we don't know what might have happened. It's a version of somebody once described as if my aunt had she'd be my uncle version of history. So, but I think it is important to think about what might have happened if Wilson hadn't been shooting, if this random act doesn't happen. Does the Irish Civil War still happen on June the 28th? I doubt it, because there's no British ultimatum. So there's no compelling reason for the for the war to start. And the peculiar characteristic of the Irish Civil War was its use of British guns. They had to borrow 18-pounder field guns from the British. Is a direct result of the Wilson shooting. So you can see here my little timetable. The four critical dates: June the 22nd, June the 26th, June the 27th, and June the 28th. So, and it's important to state as well that the anti-treaty forces in that tempestuous week held a convention on June the 18th, just 4 days before Wilson was shot, and they wanted to take on the British garrison in Ireland, not the provisional government. And they reasoned that if they took on the British garrison in Ireland, the provisional government would have no option but to join them. And in fact, the rebels holed up in the Four Courts had made no contingency to take on the National Army. The Free Staters were taking advantage of the fact that we did not want to open fire on them. We were like rats in a trap, Ernie O'Malley recalled in his posthumously published memoir, The Singing Flame. And the feeble fight put up by the anti-treaty side is evidence of a lack of preparation, though they had on paper numerical superiority over the National Army. So I guess, I would caution against the belief that civil war was inevitable. Perhaps it was, perhaps it wasn't. What would have the alternative have been? There were people, certainly within the anti-treaty side, most notably Liam Lynch, who said, we have declared for a republic and we will live by no other law. They might never have been reconciled to the new state. But I do think that the fact that the National Army used field guns on the Four Courts, to me, strengthened the resolve of the anti-treaty side to resist the provisional government. And it should also be stated that we look at it from we look at the shelling of the Four Courts as the start of the Civil War. But actually, there's an awful lot of people, the provisional government included, who thought it would be the end of the Civil War. That once the provisional government, once the anti-treaty side were routed out of the Four Courts, that they'd see sense. They'd all spend 6 months in jail, they'd be released, and some kind of compromise arrangement would be made, and the new state could start building on its on its freedom. So this. In conclusion, I'd leave you with two suggestions, and obviously I'm very happy to take any questions you have afterwards. It was fortunate that the Civil War occurred when it did for the sake of the provisional government. It was able to strike when the anti-treaty side was disorganised. Had the Civil War not happened when it happened, it would have allowed the anti-treaty side time to organise. And in fact, there was a lot of talk at that stage of organising brigades, anti-treaty brigades, etc. But that work was never really done for the reasons that I explained to you earlier. There's lots of talk of civil war, but talk is one thing, action's quite another. And also a second suggestion is that maybe the Civil War may have been the war that the new state had to have. Had it not happened, the state would have faced repeated challenges to its legitimacy. Though brutal as all wars were, it was short and it was decisive. And the emphatic victory of the Free State meant the prospect of a military coup d'etat would never happen again. And I think this is important. I was explaining to Helen earlier on that I'm writing a new book with a friend of mine about the, much closer in time to the present day, about the kidnapping a Don Tidy. Some of you will remember that event where the IRA killed a guard and a soldier at Dorada Woods in my home county of Leitrim. And one of the things that I write about in the book is the extent to which the Civil War never really ended. The IRA kept going. There were many incidences in the 30s and in the 40s when the IRA took on the state forces, particularly during the Second World War. The state hit back, and that carried on. And then, of course, when you got into the 70s and 80s, you have a renewed bout of conflict, not to the same extent, obviously, as during the Civil War between the IRA and the state. So, but the critical thing about the Civil War is that once the Civil War ended, nobody challenged the state in the same way again. And after the Civil War, the Irish Free State slowly became a normal state where the rule of law, I should say, and the will of the people prevailed. And for the last 100 years is something we should be grateful. Now, I just want to finish by showing you some pictures. I don't unfortunately have copies of my book here, and I'm really sorry. I've run out of them because my publishers run out of them. There's a new edition of my book will be published later this month. It's the paperback edition, and it has some updated information. And one of the things that's updated is you can see this here. This occurred on the centenary of Wilson's assassination in the House of Commons. This was the unveiling of a plaque. You see it here, to Wilson by Jacob Rees-Mogg, Ian Paisley Jr. and the Speaker of the House of Commons, whose name will come to me in a second, Leslie, what's his name? Anyway, who? Yes, that's right. Yeah, Lindsay Hoyle. Yes, sorry. And this is the Wilson family crest. This is the Wilson lion. The 3 stars reflect his role as a field marshal, and of course, the Hand of Ulster reflects his fidelity to Ulster. And I'm only showing you this picture because prior, on the wall here at the House of Commons, these are pictures of MPs who died violent deaths during their term of office. And it's mostly First and Second World War MPs, including Willie Redmond, who died in 1917. There are also 9 people who were assassinated. 6 of them were by the IRA. And the one that was missing all these years was Wilson. And now, see where it is? It's in the most prominent place, right behind the Speaker's chair. And just to tell you, right, I didn't really go into his background, but of course, Wilson was Irish. He was a Southern Unionist from Currygrand, County Longford. And there's now a plaque just outside the house in Currygrand, where he grew up. That's not the house where he grew up. This is simply the site where he grew up. And that is his most closest relative in Ireland, Robert Wilson Wright. And he's the dead spitting image of the Field Marshal. Look. And just one other image I wanted to show you that there's me with him. This was again this was August the 10th, 2022. This is Reggie Dunn and Joe Sullivan were hanged for the murder of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. A wreath was laid by the National Graves Association on behalf of themselves and the Sullivan family. Giles Bailey and an O'Sullivan relative was in attendance. So as you can see that there are still very conflicting views on Wilson. For some people, Ian Paisley, who campaigned for the plaque to be put in the House of Commons. He's a hero for Ulster. A lot of people call him Ulster's first martyr. Obviously, in the South, he's regarded as a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. Very happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
simplistic about it, but I wonder why they used a very large armory, artillery to attack the forecourts instead of basically starving them out of it. I mean, I understand that Rory O'Connor and his friends, his comrades, were allowed to drift in and out throughout the siege, or it wasn't even a siege. They'd go to the local pub. Why couldn't they be picked off instead of blowing up all our documents going back into medieval times? Now, I know that was unwittingly done, but they would have been a bit heavy-handed and they could have been a little bit more careful.
So your name is Tom.
Exactly.
That's a good question, Tom. I think the British ultimatum had a lot to do with the field guns and the fact that there was basically a gun to the head of the Provisional Government didn't help things. And I think the Provisional Government had run out of patience as well. You have to remember that from January, from once the treaty was rejected to June, there was a lot of agitation in the countryside. The anti-treaty side were robbing banks and giving receipts to the banks saying, "This is our money. We'll pay you back when we get into power." There had been an incident where they had stolen cars outside the garage, Ferguson's garage in Bagot Street. So I think the patience of the Provisional Government snapped, and I also believe that the Provisional Government, Michael Collins thought that they would come to their senses fairly quickly. That it would be over once the shelling started. And the other thing is as well is that when they started shelling the forecourts, they were using shrapnel shells. So shrapnel shells are no good against the walls of the forecourts. So instead, they started using high explosive artillery for the last 2 days, and the anti-treaty side had used the building beside the National Records Office as an ammunition dump. And it was a shell that hit the ammunition dump that caused the catastrophic fire that destroyed the records in the National Archives. Yeah. But mind you, on that question, the virtual archives have done an absolutely amazing job in recovering millions of documents. And they're all online now, but obviously there's no substitute for the real thing.
Is there any other activity going on in parallel with the siege of the forecourts?
On whose part?
On the IRA's part.
Yeah, well, not at that time, but the IRA had split between those who, including not Kevin Barry, but Tom Barry and a few others who wanted to take on the British government. And at that stage, Liam Lynch was urging caution. So there were two different, basically, headquarters. There was the headquarters in the Clarence Hotel that Liam Lynch was in, and then there was a headquarters in the forecourts that Rory O'Connor and the others were in. So you basically, as I said, there had been a split 4 days prior to the Wilson assassination, and the Provisional Government at that time calculated that, because the anti-treaty side were divided, that they would be a pushover basically. And what happened was they even left Ono Duffy arrested Liam Lynch on his way. Liam Lynch was on his way to Houston Station at the time, and Liam Lynch gave him an undertaking that he wouldn't agitate against the Provisional Government. Of course, as soon as Liam Lynch went down to down to Limerick, he broke his oath and he started organising the anti-treaty side down in Limerick. So, and then the Civil War begins in earnest, really, and it's followed obviously by, you have once the surrender of the garrison and the Four Courts, then you have the battle for Dublin, and the north side of O'Connell Street is destroyed, basically. Carl Brew is killed, and then the fight, switches to the rest of the country after that.
Darrell Hooper is my name.
Darrell, hi.
When you were playing What If,
Yeah.
the thought has always struck me, and I don't know a huge amount about the time, but what would have happened if they hadn't gone into the Four Courts at all? I've never fully understood from my lighter reading that and other parts of history. And just one other thing before I hand the microphone over. By a coincidence, my grandfather, his first cousin, was married to Rory O'Connor's brother Norbert.
Wow.
And I fortunately have 5 sepia prints at home they have the provenance that my grandfather, I would presume, went in and took photographs along the quays at that time.
Wow.
So value means nothing, but I'm getting to the age that they will have to be passed on somewhere.
I think they belong to the National Museum.
I would think so. Or maybe the photographic, I'm not too sure. You say the National Museum rather than the
Yeah.
Why would you say one over the other as a matter of interest?
Oh, well, I mean,
Does it matter?
no, it doesn't. I mean, you could give them locally here as well, but I do think
I think they should be probably in the National Museum.
Yeah,
Also.
so what you're saying is you have photographs from inside the Four Courts?
No, from outside, on the street. So
Right.
he would have, as a civilian, I suspect, because his, well, not blood relation, but through his first cousin,
Yeah.
he probably just went in as a civilian and took photographs.
Yes.
And they're like, some of them are very similar to the ones I'm seeing on
Sure.
television recently. But I'm more interested to understand what might have happened if they hadn't gone in at all.
That's a good
Yeah.
question. I mean, the question is, I guess the big question is, were the British serious about going back into, were the British serious about their ultimatum in the same way was Lloyd George serious in December 1921 when he promised immediate and terrible war if the Irish side didn't sign the treaty? There were a lot of people believed that he was bluffing, and that he was bluffing twice. Had the shelling of the Four Courts not happened, I suspect the Provisional Government would have played for time and tried to bamboozle the British out of doing what the British wanted to do at that time. But I think that there was a culmination of those 3 events that I alluded to earlier: the Wilson shooting, the kidnapping of O'Connell, and the British ultimatum, which led them to believe that they had no choice in the matter. And as I said to you as well, we shouldn't presume that everybody thought the Civil War was going to happen even after the shelling of the Four Courts. The Provisional Government might have hoped that would be the end of the matter, and they would have, said, lads, just let's forget about it and get on with building the state. But as we know, it didn't happen like that. So, and the war went on for another 11 months after that.
Can I ask a question, just reversing a little bit? How long did the trial last for the 2 lads?
Yeah, do you want?
How long did the trial last?
One day.
Nice and quick.
Yeah. I mean, they refused to recognise the court. They didn't put in a plea. Their barrister pleaded for clemency for them, but it was a foregone conclusion. And the two men, I think, had been resigned to their fate at that stage. Their barrister did try and take an appeal to the higher courts, but it didn't work. I mean, in those days there wasn't any doubt that they were going to be hanged. So, and they did it. I mean, they were literally caught red-handed. So it was always going to be forlorn. And the judge, what was interesting about the trial was that the guys tried to deliver the speech that eventually appeared in the Irish Independent, and the judge said to Reggie Dunn, "Now look here, Dunn, this isn't a place for a political sort of speech." And to which Dunn responded, "Well, where else am I going to say this?" But he managed to smuggle out their mission statement in 2 days later, and after they were assassinated. One other interesting point to show you the sweep of history: the day of the trial, which was the 22nd of July, 1922. I don't know if you know central London, but if you go to the what do you call it, the Old Bailey, and the Old Bailey is at the end of the Strand. And if you go back to the other end of the Strand, you have Westminster Abbey, where the coronation happened on Saturday. But on that day, there was no attention being paid to the trial of Dunn and O'Sullivan because an aristocrat was getting married in Westminster Abbey, and that aristocrat was Mountbatten. So, yeah. So you can see the sort of sweep of history. And I mean, obviously I wasn't around in 1922, but I think the impact of the Wilson assassination would have been very similar in those days to the impact that Mountbatten had in 79. With the exception that Mountbatten had retired from public life. He was 79 years of age. Wilson was only beginning, really, his role as an MP, and there was many people who thought that he could be a future leader of the Conservative Party in the UK. So, and there's even a book called The Lost Dictator by Bernard Ashe, in which it imagines that Wilson didn't die, wasn't assassinated, and went on to become a dictator similar in the 20s and 30s to Mussolini and Hitler. I think it was a sort of I don't think that was a plausible explanation, but there was a lot of people believed that Wilson had a very stellar career ahead of him as a politician before he was assassinated.
Was it true that although being very much an empire man, he intensely disliked the English?
Yes. He said the English are never serious about anything, and I've been looking at Britain for the last 7 years, and you look when you see the clowns they put into office like Johnson and Liz Truss, and you think, you think he's right. He didn't like the English particularly. He thought they didn't understand Unionists, which of course they didn't. Still don't, I guess. He considered himself, as I said in my book, his country was the British Empire. He didn't see himself as British as such. He saw himself as this part of this, as he would have seen it, this fantastic civilizing force in the world. So that's it. But he also saw himself as an Irishman, never as an Englishman. Sometimes as British, but he would have self-identified as an Irishman, and he was, as I said, from Longford. So. Anyone else? Oh, sorry, there's a...
I just always thought it was very strange that two guys that was involved in assassination had serious leg injuries.
Yeah.
You'd always think that there would be able-bodied men in assassination and get out fast. So I could never understand why they picked themselves or were they picked. I just found that a little puzzle all the time.
So I in the book I go into that. So I mean, as I say, when the paperback comes out, maybe you might buy it, because I go into that in detail. I'll explain it very briefly. It's like this: you need motive and you need an opportunity to murder somebody. The motive was Wilson's perceived role, exaggerated as it was, in the bringing into being of the Special Powers Act and of the B Specials pogroms against the Catholic population in the north, etc. That was the motivation. The opportunity presented itself only the night before, when there was a meeting of the IRA in Mooney's pub in Holborn, and at that meeting, somebody presented a copy of the evening newspaper like that and said, Wilson's going to be at Liverpool Street Station tomorrow unveiling a memorial. So suddenly the opportunity arises. And the only two people who were there, there was three people there who were who volunteered for the role. Donnan O'Sullivan and a guy called Dennis Keller, who was able-bodied and, more to the point, was able to drive a car. We've only found out in the last couple of years he was the guy who's supposed to have been there, and he wasn't. He never turned up. So the guys Donnan O'Sullivan went to Liverpool Street Station to reconnoitre the location. They realised that they couldn't possibly kill him there, because there'd be such a big crowd and they wouldn't get away, etc., etc. So they waited for him outside his house, not knowing whether he was going to turn up or not. He may not have turned up at all, and they would have had to have gone home. I mean, the amount of one of the things that go into the book is the amount of times that Irish Republicans tried to assassinate members of the British cabinet, and they didn't turn up in time, or the car didn't turn up in time, or they got the wrong address, the wrong location, the wrong time, etc. Back in those days, you had to get lucky to even get within an ass's roar, these people. It's not like, social media nowadays or anything like that. So Wilson, to his great misfortune, and all our great misfortune, turned up, went home straight after the unveiling to change his clothes because he wanted to go back in the House of Commons to make a speech, and they assassinated him on his doorstep. So the two guys were volunteered for the job, and they had volunteered previously as well. They were going to try and assassinate Lloyd George in 1921, but they ran out of time because of the truce. But they were available. And I think if Michael Collins had known the calibre of people who were going to try and assassinate Wilson, he would have absolutely hit the roof. It's crazy. It was a suicide mission, really, and I just wonder if those two guys, having lived through the horrors of the First World War, had a death wish, because so many people in those days did. The men that came through the First World War.